All right, we can go ahead and get started. Welcome and thank you for joining us this morning at our 2021 Research and Management Showcase. You are currently in web room number 3. And up first in this web room, we have a talk titled Eurasian Water Milfoil Ecology and Impacts that is going to be presented by Dr. Gretchen Hansen and Dr. Stephen Pulaski. If you have any questions of our presenters during the presentation, please drop them in the Q&A box at the bottom. That is the location that we will be using to monitor for questions. You can enter your questions at any time during the presentation. You don't need to save them for the end. I will be monitoring the Q&A and collating all those questions for when we get to the question and answer session. Just a note that if you do not see the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, you may have to hover over the bottom of the window, the Zoom window, to have it pop up. If you have any trouble, go ahead and chat me and I can try to help troubleshoot that as well. Just a quick reminder that all of our presentations will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel after the showcase. So if you missed something during this presentation, you can catch it again later today if you would like to in the same web room, or we will have those recordings online after the showcase. Without further ado, here to present their research are Dr. Gretchen Hansen and Dr. Stephen Pulaski, and I will turn it over to them to introduce themselves. Thanks for being here.
All right, yeah, thanks to everybody for being here. I am Gretchen Hansen. I'm an assistant professor here at the University of Minnesota in Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology, and I'm going to talk about the ecology side of this project. And then my co-presenter is here too.
Hi, I'm Steve Pulaski. I have a joint appointment at the university, so I'm a professor in applied economics and also in ecology, evolution, and behavior. And I'm actually here going to talk more about the economic side. So what effect does invasion have on property values?
All right, so I get to go first, and then Steve will take over about halfway through. So. I'll just start by thanking you all for being here, to MASERC for funding this project, and to our long list of co-authors here. This is a really collaborative and interdisciplinary project, which makes it really exciting and also, sometimes a fun communication challenge for the ecologists and the economists to learn how to speak the same language. So it's been fun to work together on it. Let's see if I know how to advance slides. Should be something I'm used to by now. Okay, here we go. So probably everybody here knows, we don't have to spend a lot of time on the background of Eurasian water milfoil. That is the study species for this project. And I'll abbreviate throughout as EWM, so that's what I mean. Most of us in this crowd know that milfoil is an invasive species that can cause significant impacts to recreation, to boating, just visually, and that it's been here for a while and been spreading throughout the state of Minnesota. And we were interested in understanding more about what causes it to be present in some places, what causes it to be more abundant in some places, what that means for property values, and also through understanding the drivers of what makes EWM more abundant or more likely to be present in certain places, what's likely to happen in the future as future conditions change. And then ultimately, we are going to put all of this information together, this interdisciplinary project information, into a web-based tool for communication. So like I said, I'm going to talk about the ecology side. Before I do, I just want to define a little bit about what I mean when I talk about presence or distribution versus abundance of Eurasian water milfoil. So when I talk about the distribution or presence, I mean understanding where is it. So, and we can think about that on a variety of different spatial scales. So we might think about where is it in terms of across the US, like what watersheds has EWM spread to? Or we could think within a state. This example is from the state of Wisconsin, but we can do similar things in Minnesota. Which lakes has it established in? How has it been distributed across the state? And we can also think within a lake, what sites or what points within a lake is the plant present and where is it not? And that last level of distribution is really related to the abundance or the frequency of occurrence. So how much of the lake has it filled up? Is it just in one little tiny patch, or is it really covering the entire lake or something in between? And one thing that we know about Eurasian water milfoil and most invasive species actually is that most of the time they don't get super abundant. In most cases where Eurasian water milfoil establishes, it's not distributed that much around the lake. It's rare within the lake. And that's what this little histogram over here shows. Frequency of occurrence is just the number of points in a lake, or the proportion or percent of them in which Eurasian water milfoil is found. And the vast majority of sites have very little of the plant present. And there's only a few where it gets really abundant. And that is important because the severity of the impact, both on recreation and ecological impact, really depends on that abundance. How widespread is it? If it's just a tiny little patch, we might be less concerned than if it's taken over the whole lake. And so that's part of this project, is understanding both what drives where it is, its distribution, which lakes get invaded, and which lakes support really high abundances of this invasive species. And so that's the part of the project that I am most involved with and leading with my postdoc, Dr. Thomas. And so the way that we do this to understand what drives both the presence and the abundance of EWM is to build statistical models that combine data on where the plant is. So we have access through our collaborators and through lots of cooperation with the DNR and with citizen scientists and people who are collecting plant data. We have over 2,000 surveys on lakes throughout Minnesota that go in point by point and identify what plants are there. About 150 include lakes with EWM and include both the fact that it's there and how abundant it is within the lake. So we have this really great database of aquatic vegetation surveys. We combine those with information on lake characteristics that include temperature, water clarity, a couple other things that I'll touch on, and then use our statistical models to say which lake characteristics are associated with both how likely it is that Eurasian water milfoil is present in the lake and how abundant Eurasian water milfoil is within the lake if it's present. So we're interested in both of those questions. So I'm going to just skip right to the results of those models. If anybody's really interested in talking statistics, we can do that later. So I'm going to set this up to show you the effect of the most important variables on both invasion risk. So this is the probability that EWM is present, going from 0 to 1. So 1 is it's always present all the time in lakes that have that characteristic, and 0 would be it's never present ever. And so the first one I'm showing is growing degree days, which is a measure of water temperature. It's like growing season length combined with how hot it gets. So basically, as lakes that are warmer for longer have higher growing degree days. And you can ignore these different colored lines. This is just different ways that we've built the statistical models. You can sort of ignore those and just look at the general shape. So in the case of water temperature, lakes that are warmer have a higher probability of having EWM in them, because as we go up, there's a positive relationship here. And then there's sort of a threshold. Once you get past a certain level of growing degree days, that positive effect is gone. It just sort of plateaus. So there's this real kind of critical area in here where water temperature has a big effect. If we look at abundance, so in this case, it's the proportion of the lake where EWM is present, how many points or what proportion of points is it actually there? So if this was 1, it would be every point that was surveyed within the lake has EWM in it. One thing you might notice is that this axis only goes up to 0.25. This really emphasizes the point I made earlier that most lakes that have EWM don't have a lot of it. And so when we look at sort of the average effect of something like temperature, the average abundance or proportion of lake that is filled with it is pretty low. Another thing you might notice is that the effect of growing degree days is a lot smaller than the effect on the presence of EWM. And so we do see a positive effect of temperature here as well. So warmer lakes tend to have more EWM, but the effect is not as big when we average it across all lakes. Road density was in the watershed is another variable that predicts presence of EWM. This is probably not that surprising. If there's more roads kind of around and leading to the lake, it's more likely to be invaded. We see this as sort of an index of human activity and how likely people are to go there. Road density did not affect abundance, however. Lake depth is the third characteristic that we found to be important. So here again, as lakes get deeper, they're more likely to be invaded, and a more subtle but still positive effect on abundance. Deeper lakes tend to have more points that are containing EWM. And then the last variable that we found was important was water clarity. Clarity didn't really impact invasion risk, but did have a subtle impact on abundance, again being positive. So as water clarity increases, you tend to have slightly more abundant EWM when it's present. So these are the variables that we found to be important in determining whether a lake's invaded or whether and how abundant the invasive is. Our next step is to take that information and project what we think will happen under future climate conditions. So we're in the process of doing that now. I don't have results to tell you. We're trying to incorporate uncertainty in climate projections as well as uncertainty into our models to get kind of a robust estimate of what we think is going to happen. So stay tuned for that. We do generally expect, given that we see a positive relationship between temperature and both presence and abundance of EWM, we do expect that under warmer conditions, we're likely to see more of it. But as I said, we don't have those results yet. So sum up the ecology side, we know that water temperature, lake depth, and water clarity influence invasion risk and abundance of EWM. In the case of presence or invasion risk, we know that human land use conditions, specifically road density, are important. And water clarity and some of the more local lake specific factors influence abundance more. And just again, to emphasize, we do know that water temperature is a key factor here in both presence and abundance, but that the effect is non-linear. And so we're interested to see what happens when we run these scenarios of climate change in the future. And now I'm going to hand it over to Steve.
Great, thanks, Gretchen. So I'm gonna pick up and talk about the question of if a lake is invaded with EWM, what happens to property values on that lake? And I just give a shout out here to the fellow people on the econ team part of this. So Adriana Castillo is a graduate student in applied economics and did most of the actual work of getting the data ready and running the analysis and so forth. And then also Dr. Eric Lonsdorf. Next slide. Okay, so we are asking a very straightforward question, but answering it is not, involves a lot. So I'll just say it that way. So the question that we're asking here is what's the difference in property value? So if we had two identical houses, but one of them was on a lake that was invaded with EWM and one of them was on an uninvaded lake, what would the difference in the property value be? And I'll just note, it would be great also to do abundance that Gretchen talked about. This is strictly whether it's invaded or not. So it's kind of presence or absence. And the reason for that is we didn't really have enough of the abundance data through time to be able to do that. That would be great if we have the data, and we'll do some on that. But this is strictly presence or absence of is it invaded or not. Next slide. So the reason why that this is actually a little bit difficult to get at is we don't really observe otherwise identical houses. So in particular, one might think of, and what Gretchen talked about, there are lakes which are more likely to be invaded than others. So, like road density or housing density. So if you thought about popular lakes, they might be more likely to be invaded, than not. And housing on those more popular lakes might be more valuable. So there's some things we have to try to control for. Certainly the popularity of the lake and the characteristics of the house and when the sale occurred. And so I'll talk a little bit about the statistical methods that we use to try to disentangle these different effects. Next slide. So the main thing we do is it's called a difference in difference approach. And it's easiest if you just look at the figure on the right. So we might have, property values that tend to rise through time. And there may be differences. So what I've shown here is there are lakes that will be invaded at some point, and maybe those are more popular lakes. So they tend to have higher property values. When the EWM happens, perhaps the property value drops, and we can look at the change in that gap between the invaded and the uninvaded lakes at the time of the invasion, and that change or that difference in difference is really what we're estimating as saying is the drop in the property values due to the invasion itself. Okay, next slide. And this is important because if you just did the kind of naive approach and you looked at what are the property values of houses on lakes that are invaded versus houses that are on lakes that are not invaded, in fact, that the property values are higher on invaded lakes. That's not because invasion with EWM makes the property values higher. We'll show you the opposite in just a moment. It's because they're on bigger lakes, more popular lakes, closer to the metro, etc. Okay, next slide. Okay, so just a little bit of reference here. So we're not the first people to do this kind of study. In fact, some colleagues of ours in the state of Wisconsin have done this. They've done this in Seattle area, King County, Washington, in the Coeur d'Alene area of Idaho, and in Vermont. And you get I've put the range of estimates here. So in the study in northern Wisconsin, the average reduction in property value was $28,000 from invasion of EWM, and that was a 13% reduction in the total price. And you can see the other ones, and they're generally in the teens, although the bottom one, the Zhang and Boyle study, was interesting because they were the only ones who had the data that looked at the degree of infestation. And so if you didn't have much infestation, you've got not much reduction in property value, all the way up to looking more like the picture here, where it was heavily infested, and then you get the higher end of that range. Okay, next slide. So what did we do? So we actually, most of those prior studies are on a small number of lakes or in a particular area, like one county. We actually got property sales data for all of Minnesota for the period 1995 to 2018. And this is available from Zillow, a real estate tracking company, so the ZTrax database. We took that data and we looked at residential properties within 200 meters of a lake, and that lake had to be at least 10 hectares in size. That still left us with a lot of data. Next slide. So we have in the total sample over 38,000 house sales, residential property sales. And you can see the breakdown of how many were on invaded lakes and uninvaded lakes. And then again, what's interesting here is that the invaded lakes tend to be, the property values tend to be higher. And again, this is because they tend to be more metro, more heavily used. These are the lakes, the popular lakes because we use them a lot, they tend to be more likely to be invaded and they have higher property values. Okay. And we've also got here, you know, they also tend to be bigger, they tend to have more bedrooms and so forth. Okay, next slide. However, when we do this difference in difference analysis, so again, we're trying to look at how much basically did the property values drop when the lake got invaded. When we do that kind of estimation, and here this is using all 38,000 observations, we get a mean estimate, or our that $12,863 is the kind of average reduction in property value when the lake is invaded. So if you look at the property after invasion versus prior, on average, it's about, we estimate about $12,800 below. Okay, and I've just put the other things we're controlling for here. So we have what lake it's on, we have the total square feet of the house, and we get the kind of normal things that one would expect, that as the house is bigger, it's more valuable, the number of bedrooms goes up, it's more valuable. Actually, if it's a little bit older, it tends to be more valuable as well. Okay. Actually, and I'm sorry, I said that wrong. If it's built more recently, the year that it's built, like if it's a higher number year, it's more valuable, which makes sense. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, we also did this a different way, which is many of the houses are sold repeatedly. And so when we can look and see, for example, ideally, a house is sold on a lake prior to when it's invaded, and then after it's invaded, and then we can look to see what impact that change in status of it being invaded or not had. And the advantage of using these repeat sales is then we control for basically all the other things in the house. Like we already know how many square feet it had and so forth. And so the only thing we've got to control for here when we do repeat sales is, was the house remodeled or not? So when we do this, we actually get a slightly larger estimate of the negative impact of invasion, and now it's about $19,000 reduction in property value with invasion. Okay, next slide. Okay, so yeah, just hit all of the there we go, great. So as I've told you, the $12,000 for all the sales, the $19,000 for the repeat sales, and this is, just to put it in context, is about 4% or 4.4% of the whole property value in the all sales, or 6.6% in the repeat sales. So I guess how I interpret these numbers is these are fairly substantial numbers in property value reductions. They're not as large as some of the percentage drops that were shown, for example, in the Wisconsin study. And this is speculation. I don't really know if this is true, but we're trying to kind of sort out, like, well, why might we be getting a smaller percentage loss? It could be that some of the lakes that we're looking at here have been recently invaded, and all we have is invaded or not. So we don't, as of now, we have not included the percentage of the lake that's covered, the abundance data that Gretchen had. And the reason for not including it, we did think about it and try it, is that we don't have extensive records of abundance through time to match our sales through time. So anyway, that's but that may be a reason, but there may be others. I don't know. Maybe Minnesotans or Wisconsin people differ in terms of how much they dislike Eurasian milfoil. But anyway, in both places, you get, both the Wisconsin study and here, you do get a sizable drop in property values. The other thing we did notice in our study, and this is preliminary, and so I'll just say it, but not give you any details, which is there does appear to be large variability in values across different lakes in different regions. So for example, in the metro, it appears to have a much less, smaller effect. than in the non-metro lakes where the impact is much larger. That may be due to, if we thought about how people use the lakes, if it's more recreational in the non-metro, and anyway, I won't speculate further. I'm sure people here may have other ideas about what might be true or what's causing the large variability. Okay, next slide. So as Gretchen mentioned early on, we are planning when we're going to push through the analysis, and then we're going to put the analysis up on a online decision support tool going forward. And I don't know, Gretchen, if you want to say other things about the decision support tool.
Yeah, I think we're a little bit behind in this due to COVID and everything else, but we're interested in working with the MACER team and with stakeholders and user groups as well to understand kind of what ways of communicating data might be most useful. Our team has experience doing a couple different kinds of things like mappers to look at individual lakes, or more kind of storytelling data explanation kind of data viz stuff. So just stay tuned as we and bear with us as we figure out how best to integrate all of these sort of interdisciplinary data into a web-based tool that is useful for users, and we'll be seeking input on that. And that's the end. So I think we're ready for, I'm sure nobody has any questions. Just kidding. I see that there are some.
Yes. Thank you, Gretchen and Steve. So we do have a few questions that have come in, and the first is, Gretchen, you listed a number of factors that went into the model of predicting invasion risk. And the question is, were there any factors that were you considered in that model but were ruled out in predicting either invasion risk or proportion covered?
Yeah, I should have left all the slides in here, but I don't think I did. Yeah, so we did include more than the variables that I showed. We had a number of water chemistry variables and lake morphometry kind of stuff. The ones I showed were just like the top 3 predictors. There were other ones that were included in the model that were just less impactful. And I don't have it in front of me to pull up what all those are, but we have recently published a paper, and I'm happy to share it, that describes the whole thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. And we can, I can pull that link to the paper too and drop it in the
Yeah,
chat.
should I stop sharing so I can like actually do so, or should I leave this up in case we need
You can stop sharing if you like. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Okay, so the next question is, could you clarify that warmer temps of lakes and deeper lakes are more likely to be infested? The question was, could you clarify deeper lakes tend to have cooler temps? And so can you talk a little bit about that relationship between water temperature and depth and likelihood to be infested?
Yeah, so the simple explanation is that the measure of water temp that went into this model is surface water temperature. And so there's that. So deeper lakes are cooler in the deep water. Deeper lakes might have cooler surface waters at some time of year, but this is the effective lake depth would be controlling for that. So all else equal, lakes of the same temperature, if it's deeper, it's going to be more likely to be invaded.
And to follow up on that, do you have any insight as to why warmer water temperatures mean that Eurasian water milfoil is more abundant?
More abundant or more present, or both?
More, or both.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think it's maybe easier to think about more in terms of more abundant. So we know like a longer growing season means it's gonna start growing sooner, that there's like a 10 or 11 degree threshold above which it starts really growing. So lakes that warm up faster and are warmer longer will just have a longer time that it can grow and kind of expand and spread throughout the lake. I don't have as good of an explanation for the presence, except for maybe it just is easier for it to establish in a place that has a longer growing season that enables that. I am not a plant physiologist, and so I am not 100% sure, but we do know that the longer growing, like the time that it reaches a certain temperature, and if more of the lake is like at the temperature that it wants to grow, it's going to be more likely to be able to establish and spread.
Okay, thank you. Another question on the kind of ecology side of Eurasian water milfoil. Did you cover in this study, or do you have any insight as to what the impact would be if Eurasian water milfoil was well controlled by treatment, and how that would impact your study?
Yeah, so I have something to say about that, but I feel like I am not going to answer exact. Can you repeat it, or maybe?
So the question, yeah. So the question is, what is the impact if the lake has Eurasian water milfoil, but it's well controlled by treatment?
Yeah. So that's something that I don't have an answer. It's something that we really grappled with in our trying to model like what drives abundance is a lot of these lakes are treated. And so you can kind of convince yourself either way, like, are the lakes that are treated lakes that have higher abundance, because that if it's a nuisance, it's more likely to be treated, or are the lakes that are treated, is it actually reducing the abundance? And so then we're not going to see as big of an effect. We don't have great data to be able to say, you know, pre-post treatment, which abundance should we use? So no, we did not include that at this point, but we're really grappling with how best to do it. And I'm more of a fisheries person by training, and it reminds me a lot of how we deal with stocking when we're looking at fish populations of, you know, are the lakes that are stocked good because they're stocked, or are they bad because they needed to be stocked, or is it somewhere in between? And the treatment really feels like that. We just don't have great data to know exactly when and where it was treated and what impact that had on abundance at this point.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you. And then this question from an attendee acknowledges that this wasn't in your presentation necessarily, but was wondering if you looked at tax assessments rather than just property values. And do you know if any counties are lowering their tax value assessments on properties that are infested?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer to it. We looked at property values, so we looked at sales. It's a great question to ask. You know, are the assessors catching up to the sales value? You know, and is this something that does factor in? You know, it should ideally, because, you know, if this is an observable factor and it's having a observable effect on property values, you know, the assessors should factor that in. Whether they do that right now, I don't know. You know, perhaps somebody in the audience knows, but I don't know the answer to that.
And then another question on the property values, and this is kind of the big question, is could these findings on property values being affected by Eurasian water milfoil translate to other species as well?
Yeah, I'll start, but Gretchen, you should jump in on this, because you know, the effect of, there's nothing, you know, it's not just the fact that it's named Eurasian milfoil. It's, you know, the fact that it's affecting something about the characteristic of the lake. You know, it's impacting, you know, the visuals of the lake, or the recreation, you know, if it's followed with the boatings. So, you know, if it's got some negative consequence to how people relate to the lake or how they use the lake, then one would expect that it could show up and affect property. Other invasive species could show up and affect property values.
Yeah, and, you know, we could use a similar approach to ask that question about other species. So far we have not. So I don't know that I would want to speculate on what the effects of other species might be.
Yeah. Okay. So this question goes back to the environmental predictors of risk. And other than temperature, do you think that those factors directly impact invasion risk, or might they all be proxies for usage?
Yeah. other than temperature. So, I mean, certainly road density is a proxy for usage. I think, so the models, at the risk of, copying out, the models that we build statistically are sort of agnostic to what that is, right? It's like, we just know deeper lakes are more likely to be invaded. Could that be an ecological effect? Maybe. Could that be a proxy for usage? Maybe. Could it be both? Probably. I think it's difficult to disentangle those at this point. There are some other ones that maybe are more, you might think are more of an ecological effect directly, like, some of the water chemistry variables that we included, and none of those came out as the best predictors. So I guess make of that what you will. I think it's probably both. Okay. We aren't separating, like, propagular pressure, like how much of a chance is there of it even arriving from, can it establish? We're sort of wrapping that up into one. So it's hard to pull apart.
And on temperature, still another question on that. You had mentioned in the presentation that higher temperatures, and in this conversation too, that higher temperatures can increase that risk. Is there a temperature level that seems to be a turning point? I know you showed those graphs, but can you share those numbers or even that slide again?
Yeah, I mean, there is a temperature level that's a turning point, like there is that threshold response. Because of the metric that we're using of growing degree days, it's maybe not completely intuitive to say, at 1800 surface water temperature growing degree days, that's the threshold point. Like, what does that mean? I don't think in degree days when I think about temperature. And so there is, and I think doing the climate projections work can help us to identify, like, which lakes in the state and where, and what kinds of lakes are, kind of near or maybe below that threshold now and might get above it. I think that's going to be the big question, versus which ones are already above it, and any further increase is unlikely to cause a problem.
Okay. And then I have another question for you, just for clarity on the depth and the findings on the depth in Eurasian water milfoil. So if deeper lakes are more likely to have EWM, does that mean that it is also more abundant, or does it depend on the amount of shallow versus deep water?
So depth also affected abundance. There was deeper lakes were also likely to have more abundant. And yeah, it also depends on how much shallow water or like littoral zone there is. These surveys that index abundance only happen in the near shore zone, kind of below a certain depth or depth clarity threshold, like where plants could actually grow. We're not doing plant surveys out in 100 feet of water. But the metric of abundance is really the proportion of that near shore zone that is covered. And so I don't think that the depth effect is specifically about like how much littoral zone is there. It's already controlled for that. And so for whatever reason, deeper lakes tend to have more of their littoral zone covered in milfoil, although the effect is pretty small, but it is there. So, and I'm not sure what exactly the mechanism is there, but it does seem to affect abundance beyond just how much of the area is suitable for plants in general to grow.
Okay. And then we touched on a little bit on this in a question earlier, but this one goes a little bit deeper. And the data that you used for Eurasian water milfoil presence and abundance, did that incorporate management activities into that abundance data? No. Okay. It was just what was there. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
What was there at the time of survey, which could have been pre or post or never been treated.
So pivoting the questions back to the property value side, are you aware of, is there a disclosure requirement to report the presence of Eurasian water milfoil or other AIS in real estate sale of lakeshore properties? Like there is a requirement for the presence of a water well?
It's a good question. I Sadly, I have not looked into the policy side, so I don't know, like the earlier question about our county assessors picking this up, and is there a requirement to say, I don't know whether they have to disclose or not. It's something that, it's a great question. We should look it up. And if anybody knows, please send it along to us.
And then the property value portion of this study, the question is if it has been published or will be published anytime soon?
It has not been published. We have just, it's pretty hot off the press. And we're still figuring out some of the ins and outs of the data. So what you see today is where we are, but we do hope, our intention is in fact to publish it. Hopefully soon, but not, it's academic publishing, so you got to go through reviewers and
yeah.
But yeah.
And
as the assistant professor on the call, I'll say we do hope that it's soon.
And I'll just add to that all of the publications that come out of MASERC funded projects, we do link them on the MASERC website. So when that publication does come out, we'll have it on there so that people can access it too. Okay, just a couple more questions here in our last few minutes. This one is, to what degree can risks for individual lakes either be calculated for initial invasion or progression, and how reliable are those projections likely to be? How does the degree of lake development relate to risk of invasion? So I assume that means lake shore development relate to risk of invasion.
Okay, so there's two questions there, right?
Yes.
Can we estimate risk of invasion for individual lakes, and how reliable are those estimates?
Yes.
Yes, we can. So given the lake characteristics that we identify as important, we can say, okay, so here's a lake with these characteristics. What's the probability that that EWM is going to be there? And what is our sort of projected abundance? How reliable are those projections likely to be? They are, so projection models like this become less reliable on an individual lake basis, right? So I can say, this model is like 89% accurate or whatever on the whole population. But when you go to an individual lake, it becomes a little bit less reliable in terms of, there's only one outcome of that lake. You either get it right or you get it wrong. You can't be 89% right on an individual lake. So I would say on individual lake projections, I would take it with a large grain of salt. It doesn't mean you can't use it. You can think about probabilities kind of in the same way we think about, human health projections of somebody's has this risk of getting this disease. Well, you either will or you won't, but maybe more about, are you more at risk or less at risk? So yes, and somewhat reliable, but with a grain of salt. So the other part was lake development.
Yeah, the degree of development
relate to the, like how many
risk of invasion,
like how many houses are on the shoreline or something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay.
So I'll jump in really quickly. I think that's a really good question, and it's something that we have. For example, we got already the number of property sales and properties along the lake. So it seems like something we probably could investigate. My sense, but this is just a guess, but along with the other things that we know, the road density and the usage and so forth, that the more people and the more they're using the lake, that's going to increase probabilities.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty safe guess.
That's great. Thank you. Well, we'll wrap up there. Thank you, Gretchen and Steve. So a reminder to attendees, drop your questions in the Q&A box, and I'll start reading those out for our presenters. To start us off, a question for you is hybrid milfoil abundance tracked in the lake after Eurasian water milfoil infestation? And what do we know about hybrid impacts compared to Eurasian water milfoil? Did you take a look at
that? So this sounds like a great question for our plant ecologist team, who is not presenting here today. So I am I'm sure that hybrid is tracked in these survey, well, I'm pretty sure, but we have not looked at it in this study at all.
Could you speak a little more, Gretchen, to the survey data that you used for this project? Where did that come from? Did your team collect that? Is that a compilation of data? You just give us a little
The
more
plant
insight.
survey?
Yeah.
The plant survey, yeah. So we did not collect it. Many people have collected it and done lots of work over many years to do this. And Mike Verhoeven, who's a PhD candidate, who is collaborating on this project, has worked to compile and bring these data together from multiple sources. So the DNR has collected some, individual like lake management consultants have collected some, I believe some citizen scientists have collected some, watershed organizations. So he's brought together all those surveys that have used the same methodology, so point intercept methodology, which is go out to this grid of points on the lake and throw a rake and pull it in and identify the plants that are on there. He has compiled all those data into a really powerful database that we are using as our raw data for this work.
Thank you. Next question is, the attendee is curious to hear your thoughts on how something like zebra mussels might impact property values. Zebra mussels make water clearer, which might make property values increase theoretically, but have negative impacts on some recreation, which might have a negative impact on property values. Either of you comment on that?
I'll start, but Gretchen certainly fill in. Thanks for the question, Chris. Certainly, we do know from other work that when when water quality improves, that does have a positive impact on property values. So there are some studies both from Minnesota and elsewhere that show that effect. Of course, that's not all zebra mussels do, right? So zebra mussels, clog intake, and they get on boats and docks and cause all kinds of other things. So, there's going to be a negative impact on that. I have not looked at the studies of zebra mussels and property values, but I just in the interim, when you pop that question on, I got on the internet to see. I think there are some, and so give me a few minutes and maybe I can find out.
Yeah, I think that would be an interesting one to think about. I mean, the human psychology behind change in the property values, because as Steve says, the increase in water clarity is known to improve, is associated with increases in property values, but zebra mussels are widely known negatively associated species. So I'm not quite sure how those two factors would play out. I would add that they're also, much like in our case with Eurasian water milfoil, I think zebra mussels are invading our most popular lakes, lakes that are popular for multiple reasons, including their walleye fisheries and their size and all this stuff. And so it's not entirely clear what I would predict, but maybe Steve is doing a lit review for us that he can inform us.
There are some papers out there, but unfortunately, at least they're not making it easy on you to say, here's what the impact is. It's not popping out in the abstract, but I'll keep looking.
Steve, could you speak a little bit? This came up in the first session. I think it's helpful to kind of clarify too, the question of if property taxes are being impacted and how that relates to property values and the impact of AIS.
Yeah, so in most places, property taxes are, of course, a percentage of the value of the property. So if property values are dropping, then that would have an impact on the intake of property taxes. It's earlier in a question in this morning's session, somebody said, well, are these showing up in assessed values, which of course is really what the property taxes are based on. So And I don't know the answer to that part of it. To what extent is it actually showing up? I mean, there is supposed to be a relationship between sales values and assessed values, but sometimes there can be a lag.
So a question here from one of the attendees, reading between the lines maybe a little bit, is your intent to get Minnesota citizens more engaged in AIS prevention through the pocketbook, i.e. property values?
Gretchen, you want to handle that one?
I could take a stab. So, I mean, the first part, I don't think that you have to read between the lines totally to say, I mean, so far, the analysis done by Steve and team shows there is a negative impact on property values. It's variable, and we're trying to understand that variability, for example, the metro versus non-metro, and maybe not quite as large as what's been shown in other slightly smaller scale studies. As for our intent, I would say our intent is to understand whether there is, I mean, this effect on economic values, the impact of EWM on property value has been documented in these other places. Our intent was to see, what if we do a statewide assessment in Minnesota, do we see that same result? And I think, understand bigger picture, quantifying and understanding impacts of invasive species, I think can help us all make better decisions about how we want to invest our time and resources, where we want to prevent them, and why it's important to an individual. Property values might be one reason. I also do a lot of work on walleye and ecological impacts. That might be another important thing to understand.
So I'll jump in, and I mean, my motivation in doing lots of these kinds of studies, not just this, but I do a lot of work on various ecosystem services. So it could be recreation, it could be the value of having cleaner water, and so forth. And my motivation is that oftentimes, unlike things that are bought and sold in markets, which have readily available prices, and we can see what their values are, many of the things related to the environment just don't have prices, and so they oftentimes are invisible. And invisible not just to us buying and selling things as consumers, but to public policy. And so an informed public policy should actually have all of the costs and the benefits of various actions. So to the extent that there are large costs associated with this, and we can show what those are, I think that that would call for more preventative actions to prevent spread, but it is looking at really what are the consequences of these actions, and are there large costs associated with it.
Great answers, thank you. The next one is, how did you differentiate between the differences in property values due to water quality versus EWM? In other words, how do you know your property values decrease wasn't related to water quality instead of EWM, or both?
Yeah, it's a great question. And sort of anything, the hard part in the statistical analysis here is isolating the effect of EWM from other things that are happening through time. So if there's systematic changes in water quality that are happening in this time, it may confound the effect of the EWM invasion. We are controlling for a lot of things, however, because we do have, for example, we have values going through time. So if there's a systematic trend in water quality through time, we're going to be picking that up. We also, on the the repeat sales, I mean, we do have, for example, repeat sales on lakes that aren't invaded, so we're controlling for a lot of the housing values, and repeat sales on houses that are invaded. And so there it really is trying, there are fewer things that are shifting over time so that are going to be able to confound it. But I can't rule out the fact that there aren't other things that are kind of shifting systematically in time that may be happening coincident with EWM invasion, but I don't know, Gretchen, I haven't seen water quality trends that would match up well with the same with EWM trends, but maybe there are.
Yeah, I think that would be because of the statistical methods that we're using. I think the biggest opportunity for maybe confounding those things would be if there's a water quality change associated in particular with lakes that get invaded, that kind of happens concurrently with that. And I don't know that there is, but yeah, we can't say for sure that it's not caused by something else, but we do our best to control for those things.
Thanks for that. And just to clarify, in your study, invasion is defined as presence absence of EWM, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, we would love to do this on the basis of like, percentage abundance or percentage coverage. As we said, it just unfortunately, we don't have as many lakes where we have that data. And when we have that data, it's not like through time. So it's much harder to then match that up with the property values and the changes.
I know this came up in the first session too, but related to this, that any treatment of EWM isn't accounted for too. It is just that presence absence of the species.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Could you speak a little bit to what degree can risks for individual lakes either be calculated for initial invasion or progression, and how reliable those projections might be?
Yeah, so we can take the ecological models that we've built that predict the probability of a lake being invaded and the sort of predicted abundance associated with those lake characteristics. We could do that for individual lakes. I always caution with this kind of model that they're most useful, I think, on a sort of broader scale, because we can quantify their accuracy and their uncertainty in terms of across multiple lakes. And when you drill down into an individual lake, it's not so much about probability, it's about, did you get it right or did you get it wrong? So it's either right or it's wrong for an individual lake, did it get invaded? But we can say something about, is this, higher risk or lower risk than average? And how is that risk likely to change under future climate conditions? That I think, like any predictions under future scenarios should be taken with a grain of salt of, we don't know for sure what's going to happen in the future, but we can maybe use this to inform some of our decision making, and depending on our risk tolerance, kind of what we want to do with that.
So we have another question related to kind of the transfer of these learnings to other species. And the question is, would you consider looking at property value decreases in curly leaf pondweed infestations, considering curly leaf can have large impacts on water quality as well?
I'll just say, the technique that we're using, and now that we've got, the property value data there, so on the kind of property value side, we could do that. We would have to have, the really nice thing for me on this project is working with Gretchen and the team, where they've assembled all of this great information on EWM. So we'd have to have that information also on the these other invaders. But in principle, if you have that information, then yes, by all means, we could do that.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. We do have that information on curly leaf pondweed from these same surveys, and our experience working on this project has been, we got access to this Zillow database, which is a beast of a monster to deal with, but contains, millions and millions and millions of records. And the work that the economics team has done to kind of wrangle that and make that apply, like identify the lakeshore properties and all the things, that we now have that data set that we could explore other questions related to lakeshore properties and other impacts of other invasive species.
And you may have mentioned this in your presentation, but can you just kind of highlight why Eurasian water milfoil was selected as the species of study for this one?
Why was it selected? Well, because we had the plant database in hand. Because we were interested in looking at, well, I guess on both sides, the climate change question. You know, we had an ecological basis for thinking that warmer temperatures might change the distribution of this species, given that it has a temperature associated with growing and all that. And on the economic side, that we had seen these property value changes documented in other studies, but that most of them were relatively small scale and hard to know how they would apply to, you know, the entire state. So there was sort of a basis for it already we wanted to build on, as science does.
That's great. Thank you. Well, that brings us to 3 o'clock. So I am going to cut off our discussion here. But if anybody else in the audience has further questions, feel free. Gretchen had her contact information up. Steve, I think you did too. Otherwise, always feel free to email macirc@umn.edu, and we would be happy to help answer some of those questions and connect you with the team. Gretchen and Steve, thank you again for your presentation and the discussion. Our next presentation will be starting at 3:15, and here in this room, the presentation will be identifying genes for zebra mussel biocontrol. So go ahead, take a little break, and we will see you back in about 15 minutes. Thank you both.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.